Welcome everyone to ALN Thursday at 3. My name is Mike Bordnar. I'm the Executive Director of the Asset Leadership Network. And today on our program, we have Rich Culbertson, who is a Pittsburgh resident and has a daughter who lives near the bridge that collapsed. And he's done some research, and we're going to talk about the implications of that disaster. And luckily, no one was killed. But we're going to use that as an example of how to improve asset management throughout the U.S. Before we get started with that, I want to thank our patron members. We couldn't do this without their support, and our organizational members, which are growing. And before we get started with Rich, I want to talk about next week. We have Hugh Sinclair, the Division Manager of Enterprise Asset Management at the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission. And February 16th, we're continuing our series with the Australian Asset Management Council, Values and Benefits from Asset Management. We're going to be hearing from the state of Victoria, Australia, and their extensive asset management program. And then we're going to be hearing also from the Atlanta Airline Terminal Company. And 2022 is a very active year for the Asset Leadership Network. We're starting a municipal asset management showcase series with our new member Aesthetic. And our first program is going to be on the city of Greater Geelong. And that's a city in Australia, and they have dealt with infrastructure issues. So this will be kind of a prelude to our ALN Summit, the Winter Summit, Sustainable Value Creation from Infrastructure Asset Leadership, which will be afternoon programs on March 15th and 16th. So mark your calendars for those, and we'll have information about the registration in the newsletter on Tuesday. And this is not a PowerPoint presentation. These Thursdays at 3 are discussions, but Rich is a very, very thorough engineer. And when I asked him to talk on the subject, he did some research. And this PowerPoint presentation will be available if you're to download. And I'm just going to run through it really quick so we know what we're talking about. Here's the aerial. This is the area underneath the bridge that Rich's daughter and her husband walked on a regular basis. This is very personal. His daughter lives right near this place, and Rich is a Pittsburgh resident. So this is it touches us directly. And like I said, thank goodness there were no fatalities. That's a 65-foot long bus, looking pretty small there. And there it is being taken off. And Rich, in his thorough engineering way, has done some research so he would know how to talk about this subject. And like I said, we're not going to be addressing these slides directly. We're just going to be talking. So why don't we get to that? Rich, thank you for joining us.
What's a pleasure.
So what was your first thoughts when you heard about the bridge collapse?
Well, I was at home, and sometimes I have the TV on, sometimes I have radio on, and sometimes I have a wife who's watching out for me. And I'm not sure which one it came first. But I heard that the bridge had collapsed, and a lot of folks were on this scene. Eventually, the leaders of the city showed up. Even the Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania showed up in shorts. I don't know whether he forgot to put his pants on, or whether he this was so important. After working out at gym, he decided to get there quickly.
Yeah, probably.
But the main thing was noticed immediately, there was no one killed in this.
Yeah.
This was something of which 10 people apparently did have to go to the hospital, but considering the amount of destruction and the situation, when you go through the photos, and again, On the ALN website, you'll be able to spend more time with those photos. You can also look at the internet too. There's a lot of photos on that. But this is one of those things that it ruined a lot of people's day here in Pittsburgh. And about 14,000. I'm sorry.
For many days to come too.
Well, that bridge is used about 14,000 times a day. That's the traffic on it. And so it's a major thoroughfare within Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's a big deal because the fact is we don't see bridges collapse every day. You know, we did see one a few years ago where several people died up in Minnesota, but this thing came down.
Yes. So what did you look into when I asked you to talk about the subject? What was your first instinct?
Yeah, well, I'm involved in I'm interested in a whole bunch of things. I like to know how things work. I like to know about internal controls. I like to see like what happened, what were they dealing with, how did this happen, what were the facts and circumstances surrounding it at the time, how could this happen, and so with that, I decided, well, let's take a look as much as you can, so what they were doing, what's available in the press about this, and then try to go through as to how did this in fact happen. And in fact, it did put my family in jeopardy. My daughter and her husband would walk under that bridge like every weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And that particular day didn't. It was a cold day, less than 10 degrees outside. And so sometimes that on cold days, material acts a little differently. So. And
well, what did you find when you did some research?
Well, what I found is that this particular bridge was identified as in poor condition. That there's a 9-point scale on that bridge, and they do it with the 3 different areas: the surface of the bridge, the overall structure, and the substructure of the bridge. And so there's 3 different areas. The base of the top, and that substructure is what holds the bridge up. Now, the first 2 were rated as poor. The substructure that holds up the bridge, it was rated as satisfactory. But when you take a look at the photos, it seems like the surface held up. You still see the surface. You also see the overall structure. It held up to it. And the substructure, that's the one that in fact failed. So when you do condition of things, it should in fact reflect reality. So here again, we're talking about internal controls, though, but that's also some of the areas that we really need to make sure things are reported properly, because
right.
decisions.
So what we want to do is use this bridge as an example of how we can improve asset management, assessment, internal controls in order to prevent more of this happening. So
Sure.
There's a question already, right, off the top, a couple of them. Do you know when the last condition assessment was performed? And are there any regulatory requirements for condition assessments?
Yes, it was last reviewed in September of last year. Several years ago, the state of Pennsylvania said this thing ought to be evaluated annually instead of semi-annually. And it was reviewed by an international company that reviews bridges. However, a lot of things require calibration. So, but when you use calibration, you've got to make sure you're calibrating to the right thing. When they measured the bridges, of the 9-point scale, that was probably useful for budgetary purposes. If things were in poor condition, give them more money to get them up.
Okay.
But they didn't really affect what I consider risk assessment. In ISO 55000, we are concerned with risk. And we're also concerned, of protection of assets and receiving value from assets. at this point, there's no value to this asset while it's on the ground. I mean, it's a big problem because 14,000 people will have to change their way to get to work or where they normally go. And therefore, it's a major problem as far as value. It's a much negative value. Now, when this bridge was constructed, for example, I think it cost like 1.5 million, 43 years ago. They thought they'd have to spend $1 million to get it up to speed. Now they're going to spend more like $23 million to get it back up.
Mm-hmm. So Bob Stanton asked a question that kind of goes along with what you were saying, that they had evaluated on a financial basis, but they had not done a risk management evaluation, certainly not in accordance with an ISO standard. But Bob asks should there be inspection criteria or processes that can be modified?
The answer to that is absolutely. The criteria was used, was established probably like in 1968. There was a law that required, federal law that required all bridges to be evaluated. And then they established a database in 1995. Well, we know 1995, well, that's pretty close to when the Uruguay Accords were signed as far as the establishment of international standards. Well, they didn't change their mind. They've been using that same database, same construct to evaluate bridges since 1995. They didn't go to it like an ISO 31000, which is risk assessment. Didn't use, like a safety standard of ISO 45000. Certainly didn't use ISO 55000. So they blind themselves as to modern standards, even though there's laws, rules, regulations, and such, federal, but also state. That all these agencies are supposed to adopt, things like internal controls and generally accepted audits on an annual basis. But even with all that, sometimes certain agencies just don't get the message.
Well, I think what you're saying is pretty much a human behavior factor. So there is an old system in place and people just don't want to try something new. There are new standards in place now, but it's hard for people to change and adopt new tools and processes. However, the rate at which tools and processes are evolving now, we just have to always be upgrading and adopting. Perhaps we can use this as a means of getting some of the more contemporary standards embedded in the rules and regulations for the distribution of the infrastructure funds.
Well, what it is that the owner of this bridge was the city of Pittsburgh. And they may have done this bridge on the cheap, you might say. But the fact is, it's 442 feet long. It's about 30 some odd feet wide. So it's meant to be a long bridge, but also a wide bridge. And so they were, to me, hobbling along. At one point in time, they lowered the amount of weight to be on the bridge at 26 ton. Well, that bus weighs about 21 ton. And so when you see the amount of rain and the other vehicles are on it, and there's 14,000 cars going across that on a daily basis, you can think that at some point in time, there's like 1,000 cars on that bridge per hour. And so that 26,000 weight limit was obviously ignored.
Yeah, and why did they reduce the weight limit? Did they have fears about the ability for it to support? And why didn't they bring it up to its original rating of 3,600? Do you know if there was any funds available or had money been spent on?
I think when decision makers know that there's an emergency, that bridge is going to be shut down by authorities because it's not in poor conditions, it's in unsatisfactory condition. Now, I think most would say just common sense. If you have a 4-lane road that goes 440 some odd feet long, and you're only can put 28,000 pounds or 28 tons on it, that should tell you that this probably thing is unsafe. So they did in fact reduce, but the fact is that even those numbers are arbitrary. A lot of times when you're dealing with weight, there'll be load testing. Well, you can't load test the bridge very well, because if you load test it too far, the failure, of course, is collapsing. And so whatever it was done arbitrarily. And the arbitrary number obviously wasn't good enough.
Yeah. So let's see. So the numbers, we don't know about the budget. Somebody's asking, Boyd's asking about a separate agency to inspect municipalities to meet standards. Cecilia wants to know about grades and how they impact bond ratings. But basically, it comes down to what can be done to prevent this going forward. From your research, do you see anything that looks like an immediate action that could be taken?
Yes. Owners should take action in ownership. First of all, if it's owned by the city of Pittsburgh, it's the responsibility of the owner to make sure they're using the right standards. Even though the federal government may be using obsolete standards, the state may be using obsolete standards, but it's the owner who has the responsibility to use the right standards and take ownership responsibility and making sure they're using the ISO business systems management. And they didn't. Now, recently today, for example, I received another letter from the Allegheny County person responsible for bridges. And he claims that, well, they spent, $25 million in the last few years on repair of bridges. And that seemingly that Allegheny County does not have the same problem as Pittsburgh. But the fact is, if decision makers know that this bridge is going to collapse, I think the decision was they would have found the money, or the money was there.
Yeah.
Do it. But the will was not there, nor was the interest.
So another thing that you've said to me is that there's plenty of regulations in place. GAO has the internal controls listed. If you're getting federal funds in any way, you should be following them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you think can be done to help ensure that what's existing is the existing requirements, how they're met?
I think, first of all, it's important that decision makers, management throughout an organization have to recognize the overall regulations. Part of those regulations are 2 CFR 200. And that's a very good regulation, but it's about 400 pages long. But it also incorporates
What does it address?
It's required, if you receive any sort of grant from the federal government, you're now subject to this. So Pennsylvania receives substantial grants from the federal government. And also those grants flow down to municipalities and cities and such. Mm-hmm. And they're also subject to that. And also when you take a look at the controllers of some of those organizations, they in fact do use things like the GAO Yellow Book for their auditing guide. Some do not. But all those things must be in harmony. And the whole organization must understand what those regulations are. But in this case, clearly, they did not follow the internal control framework nor the proper auditing. Yeah, they went through an auditing, but it's wrong auditing. That when we talked about, well, what's the right way to do that? Well, you have to meet the risk. That it is not for budgetary purposes. It's in fact risk mitigation. What's the risk of not meeting our objectives? Well, our objective, of course, is to keep the bridge up and having it functional for the purpose of which was intended or is used now. Obviously, something went wrong. If you have a bridge that's only rated at 26 tons, but yet you have 14,000 cars or vehicles a day going over there, just that should tell a decision maker or anybody who's thinking there's something wrong here.
Yeah. So we've got
So,
quite
so,
an act.
so in other words, a lot of times what happens in organizations, people will put responsibility onto somebody else. I'm not at fault, somebody else's fault. And I think what you'll find here too. And I'm sure that the person who did the rating back in September, that person will be questioned quite heavily. And the newspapers are also saying, we need to find out what happened here. And so we would expect what will happen here. We'll see the press, but we'll also see the National Transportation Board. Well, take a look at this. Well, NTSB, they'll do an investigation. But the problem is that they expect to have a report within a year and a half. The best thing on reports is timeliness. Now, they may have a preliminary report, but the fact is, a year and a half to get a report out is not good enough.
We've got quite an active chat going on here. I don't know if you're watching any of that, but it's talking about right now integrated traffic engineering studies. And Boyd points out that the utility line, the gas line, broke across that too. So it shows that it can't be a siloed activity. This is not just important because of bridge. There could have been telecommunications, water. There was a gas line, natural gas line.
And of course, what happened to that gas line is that once that broke, and now you have gas being going into the atmosphere, and there can be a certain amount of risk for that.
Yep.
Not that so much risk, as far as the gas escaping at that point in that amount, because there has to be, for a gas explosion, usually has to be a confinement, and there has to be the right gas air mix, and there has to be a spark. But when they turn the gas off to the whole neighborhood, and Pittsburgh has a fairly old population. So if they turned off the gas to several blocks, then they turn the gas on, that in itself can cause a whole lot of problems. Because they may miss somebody, gas may not be turned on, and it may cut again, and it is 10 degrees outside. People can get cold pretty rapidly.
Yeah. So we're using this, let's say, there's a lot going on in the discussion there. Jim, if you want to be monitoring the chat and helping us if there's anything come up, that would be great. But Rich, I want to ask you that about the way we can learn from this and how can we move forward. Thank goodness there were no fatalities. There's going to be huge inconvenience for the 14,000 people who are using that bridge, the community surrounding it, just the implication the people using that path aren't going to be able to do that anymore. There's quite a disruption. Mm-hmm. But what can we learn about the way people are managing assets and how people might want to manage your assets better? There's many bridges throughout Pittsburgh. This is not the only bridge.
Well, this is the most bridged city in the world. A lot of bridges in Pittsburgh area. Right. I have a Bridgeville about 3 miles from me. Ambridge is not too far from us. In other words, a lot of these steel company towns were named after bridges. So Pittsburgh was a major contributor of bridges in the United States and around the world.
Okay.
That park was Frick Park. And I don't know if folks understand who Frick was, but Frick and Carnegie partnered to create U.S. Steel. And so I'm sure, and it looks like to me that the bridge was top heavy, more concrete than steel. And so I think that Mr. Frick would be turning over in his grave if he found out what happened to his bridge.
So what can we do to make sure that other bridges don't suffer the same fate?
Let me get back to your prior question. What can people do?
All right.
I think we see both the use of standards, but also what's required for publicly traded corporations throughout the world, but also the U.S. government and states and municipalities is the whole area of internal controls. Now, when we talk about internal controls, we're talking about effective and efficient operations. So you can almost take a look at, is it effective and efficient? Then what is not effective and efficient? Then next beyond that is that part of that is protection of assets. That's also an objective. Well, they didn't do a good job of protecting assets. The next one is reliable reporting. Well, we found out that they didn't do a good job of having reliable reporting. If it had been more reliable reporting that shut the bridge down, then possibly this wouldn't have occurred. It was spent the money and got it fixed before the bridge fell. The latter portion of that is compliance laws and regulations, standards. Well, they didn't do a good job of that either. So if companies and segments of government actually use the internal control framework and design their systems around that, and part of that design is having objectives, then also doing risk, where you assign how do you prevent and detect deficiencies. In this particular case here, they needed a process where they need to protect what they want to protect, but they also need to detect when what they intended was not working. We would also say, for example, if you were doing this again, modern day, you would probably have sensors on that bridge. You would probably also be concerned on cold winter days where they hadn't cleaned up snow. Because anytime you bounce up and down on something in the snow, there's other chance of failure. So the engineers and those who are associated with this need, obviously, and traffic managers need to understand the risk associated with very, very cold days, as well as overstressing the bridge with too many cars and such.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. And Boyd makes a very good point that insurance companies and bond rating agencies might want to use ISO 55001 as a rating system for evaluating bond rates and insurance rates for asset owners.
Absolutely. And again, it needs for those folks who in fact are doing those inspections for the insurance company are in fact looking at the right things. And they may not necessarily be look at has other people that looked at it, where they may be using the wrong measurement systems. So for the insurance company and their folks, that's really important to make sure that they in fact protect their shareholders and also make sure they avoid these types of accidents.
And Jesse Rothkopf is talking about the National Bridge Inventory also, and that they have inspections every 2 years, and possibly risk assessments could be conducted more frequently once it goes below a certain condition. But I think more importantly, what you were saying is rate the bridges based on risk, not on financial.
Yeah. Well, too, what happened was supposed to happen during the Trump administration. Each of those agencies were supposed to review all their regulations and then modify them, get them up to date. Well, if they're still using a database that was used back in 1995, that probably should have been an indicator that maybe that 1995 database was not sufficient for today based upon current standards.
That's a really good point. So we very quickly got to the end of the program here. So I'm going to do this, and then we're going to ask Marty Rowland, who was the first one to report about the bridge, to us to join. But again, we want to thank our patron sponsors, our organizational members, and remind you to sign up and join us next week. Hugh Sinclair is always a treasure to talk with, so that'll be a great program. And remember, February 16th, we've got value and benefits from asset management. And in March, the city of Greater Gulong. And again, in March, we've got some infrastructure, sustainable value creation from infrastructure asset leadership summit. So let me stop sharing and we'll go to make Marty a panelist, see if he has time to join. Marty is a ALN senior fellow, and he is on the board of a school that focuses. Marty, I'm going to let you explain your position at the school.
Well, good. I think you can hear me. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I thought the
So first, Marty,
yeah.
please explain your position at the
the Henry George School.
Henry George School.
Yeah, so I'm on the board of the Henry George School of Social Science. I'm also an instructor there. I'm also author and subcommittee chair for the E3210 infrastructure management standard. But a thing that I did want to point out, I thought Rich did an excellent point on having the bond agencies require that ISO 55000 and maybe the E3210 be a requirement for owners of bridges and such, so that somebody can actually put their neck out on the line rather than just driving by and giving these ratings. So that was the main point. But one of the points I was bringing up in the chat is that it seems like it's all or nothing. So we have this fantastic list of bridges that need to be fixed. Why not on a temporary basis shore them up so that they don't fall? Of course, it's going to cost a lot of money just to shore them up, but having ugly bridges might be enough for people to say, why don't we just fix that once and for all? But the idea of shoring them up, at least you're doing something so that you don't have mass death and inconvenience. It just seems kind of irresponsible to say, yeah, it might fail, but well, if only somebody could give me money. Well, screw that. Let's be responsible engineers. And if something's about to fall, you put a brace under it.
Yeah, Marty, you're exactly correct. That in this particular case, that they knew 2018 that there was underneath that bridge was weak. Things had rusted, and as opposed to fixing things, they just cut off the rusted piece, fell apart. And so that's as good as that. When your car has a red light on it, with black tape on it.
Yeah.
And then as opposed to doing the right thing, they did substandard work with it, probably outside of what an engineer would do under the same circumstances.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things you have to be careful. Progress is not from action. Action is supposed to lead to progress, but it may not. In that particular case, the action was not effective action. But that's a thing that all this, again, when we talk about effective, efficient operations, we're talking about full effective operations, including risk assessment and people who are competent to look at things and can envision. And here again, a lot of these touch base with other standards, and some of this stuff is also things that it takes. It's a real talent to be able to see hazards, but it also takes courage to follow up those hazards and report to the right place. And here, it didn't follow through as much as it needed to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some of this reminds me of the famous levees in New Orleans that failed. I had a friend who was on the levee board. after it failed, but the report was that levee inspectors would just drive like 30, 40 miles an hour down the road and say, oh, okay, check it off. So I'm afraid that too much of that is going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Drive-bys don't count.
All right, so I am going to break with tradition and show PowerPoints. Just a little detail because it shows Rich's photos show that that was reported. That's the problem. Look at the girth of that. So then here's the repair. It's connected, but that's not the same girth. Now there may be more braces, there's more of that, but if that was rusted out, well, you could see that here is the downspout. That could have been rusted out because the downspout had been bad at one time and was leaking on that. And they might have thought that that was the only place where the problem was. But if there was that much damage there, I can't, I'm not an engineer, so.
Well, you don't need to be an engineer. You know that I'm not an engineer either, but I'm responsible for certain properties to make sure they're safe. And you have to look at certain things as our own common sense. We don't walk out in front of cars. Why? Because we're smarter than that. This is kind of the same thing too. As you see something that's rusted like that and that fell apart, it's so bad. It's not only the part that fell off, it's also the part that fell from. And there's no indication the part that fell from was ever reinforced. And
Right.
So if you take a look, well, where's the weak area? Well, we know the weak area was one of those beams going up, that's holding the substructure.
So this cross bracing is here.
Yeah.
So that was already there.
Yeah. But what the substructure is, what's holding that up?
Yeah.
Those things they're going vertically.
So this is the wire and the bubble gum. That's,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you say the bubble gum fix?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So they already tried to do that. So
They did that. Yeah.
Okay.
And again, that was an outside firm who did that, which means the facilities had to in fact hire the outside firm with a certain amount of engineering drawings of what to do.
Boyd points out that there's no indication of rust prevention paint. And Jack Kelly's calling for citizens to take action to paint red bridges that might be dangerous.
Yeah.
It's an idea.
So I appreciate everyone's input. There's a lot of passion involved in this topic. I think the Asset Leadership Network is in a great position to try to bring attention to systematic improvements in processes and policies that result in strategies that prevent this from happening. I think we can use the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act rules and regulation period to get some of our ideas to the federal agencies that may have an impact on improving the condition of these failing assets. Rich, you want to make any closing statement?
Yeah, I think there still needs to be on some of this is that decision makers need to make sure there are others who would actually address this type of item that have direct contact with decision makers to where it's not a problem with added funding. It may be a problem with as far as poor judgment, but poor judgment can also be improved with people who are responsible for good judgment. And I think that the knowledge of completing the standards, having those things in place, continual reviews of those things make a difference. And hopefully this is a big lesson learned where we don't have other bridges falling. And that this should become a defining event in the United States and perhaps the world, what not to do.
You would have thought that the Minnesota bridge collapse would have been that defining event, and it's a shame that it wasn't.
Yeah. Well, we're a lot more active nowadays. So
All right. Well, thanks to everyone for attending. Thank you, Marty, for jumping in and providing some additional insights. And again, thanks. This was a well-received topic, and maybe we'll do more programs that are related to current events. So let us know what you think, and thank you all. See you next week.
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Appreciate it.
See ya.